It's time for Life Unfiltered, the show that celebrates the messy, perfectly imperfect parts of life. Your hosts are Deborah Gansenberg and Lisa Sugarman. Deborah is the mom of 3 boys and a clinical psychotherapist. And Lisa is the mom of 2 girls, an author, and a syndicated columnist. And together, they authored the book, How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay with It.
I'm Deborah Gansenberg, a local psychotherapist and author, alongside my friend and accomplished author, Lisa Sugarman, for another week of Life Unfiltered. This week, as we continue our dive into summer, we wanted to talk about a chapter that comes straight out of our book, How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay with It, and have an honest conversation about the differences between consequences and punishments and why parents need to know the difference. Since we're at the start of summer and kids are out and about and freer schedules and less supervision in many cases, more freedom, and it might be useful for our listeners with young kids to commiserate and learn a few things, since kids are having more interaction with their friends and peers than they've had in a really long time, which can lead to some not so great decisions and consequences for their actions. So as parents, we need to be ready to differentiate between an appropriate consequence and a punishment, since there is a difference. The impact of either of these actions are also very different. As a therapist, I'm really careful not to use the word punishment or implement punishments in my work with kids and parents. So we thought it would be good to listen in as we discuss how every kid loves to push buttons and limits. And we want to help you understand what to do with it. So Lisa, why don't you give everyone a quick overview of how we define each of those things and why we want to stick with one versus the other?
You know, I've really been excited to have this conversation, and you and I have been talking about having this conversation for a while, and then we've done other things that we felt were, more timely at the time. But I know from conversations that I've had with so many other parents out there, all different age ranges, that with kids, all different age ranges, that there's a lot of misinterpretation about punishments and consequences, because a lot of parents see them as kind of interchangeable words and things, but they really aren't. And, even though the word consequence typically has, I think, a negative connotation, it doesn't always have to be a negative thing. It's like anything, because it depends on how you spin it. That's why I think our goal as parents shouldn't be to try and prevent negative behavior, because that's a lost cause and totally impossible.
That's impossible.
Right, exactly. It should actually be more about reinforcing positive behavior, which is why we should never be giving our kids punishments for their actions in the first place. That's just, it's nothing but negative, especially when you consider that a punishment, if, by definition, is nothing more than retribution or just getting back at someone. That's the point of a punishment. And we both know that it's just not the way to raise a kid. And a consequence, though, is an effect or a result of somebody else's actions. So it's super important to understand the difference between the two. So if you think of it this way, in different terms, what we need to do in terms of being effectively disciplining our kids, it boils down to a couple things. First, we have to consistently bring down the hammer, I guess you could say, when our kids need a consequence. And the second thing we need to do, and you and I talk a ton about this in our book, we have to hold the line as parents once we throw out that consequence. So once we say it, we've got to follow through with it, because that's the key. And how many of us are so guilty of like, you're losing TV, you can't use the car, you can't, we're tossing stuff out.
Your Nintendo away for a month.
Right. And then we're like, they come back and they apologize, or you resolve things and you don't stick to that. I'm guilty of that a million times. I'll toss stuff out. Now it's really just, it's our kids' job to test our limits, and we have to react to that. So now I want you to explain, how do we handle that behavior when they're pushing those limits? What are some tips? What do we do about it?
It's actually really simple. I think, as I share in the book, it's our children's job to push limits and buttons. It's actually what they do.
Right.
and it's the way that they learn. So they are challenging your rules because they are navigating their way around, and they may or may not understand what is okay, what isn't okay, what's acceptable, what's safe, on and on and on. And so it's up to us as parents to teach them by setting limits and boundaries. So when a child tests, they are looking for information. So it is up to us to provide it. Some kids appreciate the rules and information up front, like they want to just know exactly what's expected of them. That was my oldest.
Yeah.
And others really like to receive the information and then test the shit out of it to see if it's accurate, really.
Yeah.
So, like, don't touch the stove, it's hot. There are going to be some kids that do everything they can to try and touch the stove because they need to know if it's true.
Yeah.
So for many, the oldest kids are typically the rule followers because they are not watching others in front of them push or test the limits. So they learn the rule and follow it. Whereas often the younger sibling or siblings, they're watching the older sibling do something different and they want in. So this happens a lot, like with bedtime, the older sibling gets the later bedtime.
Right.
So
monkey see, monkey do.
Right. And so the younger sibling gives you a run for your money because they're trying to push off their bedtime and stay up with the older one. And that was like the most common argument in the house was, well, why does he get to stay up later? And so for parents who are being pushed and tested, it's incredibly helpful that when you have these kinds of moments that you shift your thinking a bit and remember not to assume actually that your kids know or even understand certain things, and especially around what you're asking of them. So plan to repeat, reteach, and reinforce what it is you're trying to have your child learn and understand. So finding your patience as a parent is it's tough because parenting is tiresome, it's frustrating, and at times a battle. So parents, remember, they don't wake up in the morning, the kids, and say, hey, how can I be a pain in the beep today, the butt? So if if we stop and think about that, when they are misbehaving or pushing limits or testing you, what is their behavior trying to communicate? So that's important.
And it's something that I think in the heat of the moment, because there are so many moments that can get so heated because they're kids.
Heated moments.
Right.
Sure.
Doing what kids do. And so we often get so buried under the weight of those moments and we're in those stressful situations and we can't take that step back, or we don't take that step back because let's face it, like those moments happen a lot when we have children. Right. So you're kind of hopping from one to the other. Being able to understand, like, what are they thinking in their head from their point of view is really valuable. I also think one thing that's really super important for us to remember is that and you've already basically just said this, that our kids are going to challenge our authority, our rules, our advice every single chance that they get. And they do it for what feels like an insanely long time. Like you feel like you're in this place with them and these behaviors for a really long time. And it's long enough, I think, that we're actually almost convinced that they will never outgrow it. In their defense, though.
Do they?
Yeah, I know. They do.
I'm sorry.
They do, therapist Deb. They do.
Oh, they do? I don't know. Don't you still push your mom's limits?
Do I? God, I hope she's listening right now. Mom, can you call me later, honestly, and tell me if I still do these things? I don't think that I do. But, in their defense, though, the reason why they do the dumb stuff and say the dumb stuff is because they just have not been around long enough to understand those laws of cause and effect, which is why they're constantly making the same mistakes over and over and over again, which goes right back to what you said a few minutes ago about, like, you have to constantly be saying the things and reminding of the things and reinforcing the things. You get to this point where you just want to bash your head against a wall because they never seem to learn anything. But don't panic if you feel that way. That's my message in this moment.
Yes.
Don't panic if you're feeling that way, because we all feel that way at some point along the line. And it takes a really long time for a child's brain to form all of those connections and synapses that are necessary to learn how to reason and to think like rational, intelligent humans. So
does that ever happen, really?
Yes, it totally does. It does.
Rational and intelligent?
Yes. The same person can be those things. And it's incredible.
Wow.
You know, it happens. And it, we just all need to perfect. When I say we all, I mean us parents need to perfect the art of taking really deep breaths and resigning ourselves to doling out and enforcing whatever appropriate, and there's a key word there, is appropriate, consequence is necessary in the moment. And remember that consequences are reminders to our kids of what to do and what not to do. Because if we hold that line, like I talked about when we're establishing boundaries, we're all going to win way more of the battles than we lose ultimately. So when we set boundaries and create consequences, what are some more tips for how to make sure that they're impactful in the right way?
Okay. Yeah, because I think we work so hard to do it, and then sometimes we don't realize the way that we're doing it definitely will impact whether or not it's going to work or it's not going to work.
Yeah. Right.
I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
When you say like hold the line or toe the line, explain to the listeners what you really mean by that. Like what does that mean?
What I mean when I say that, and I know it's what you mean too, is that when we issue a consequence, for instance, we don't back down. We follow through. Holding the line is just like, it's like Kleenex and tissue. It's like the same exact thing. It's like we're following through with standing firm on whatever it is that you've said or you've done, to follow through with that consequence.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
I just wanted to clarify, because for some people they're like, what are you towing, a line?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad that you said that, because it's relevant. So that's what
So I know you asked me to share some tips on how to make sure that what we do when we set boundaries and create consequences are impactful. And I do. There are so many important things to consider. And I think the key to any parent's success is when it comes to setting up anything, it is the consistency and the follow through. So that's why I wanted you to clarify when you took the line. I think that it truly is probably the number one and most important piece to anything that we do in parenting. And there are a lot of different tips and tools around trying to keep the boundaries and the consequences important and impactful. So one is toe the line, which you had said. So whether you make the chore chart, a list of things that must be done, a rule list, or even a reward list, it all sounds good, but it doesn't work by itself. So parents, work within your own skill set and set up yourself for success. And so when I say that, I mean, if you're a parent that does have some kind of, attentional issues or poor attention to detail, it is important to know that about yourself and enlist your partner or support in your system to pick up what it is that you need help with. So is that my one? Do I have any more time?
Yep. No, I think we'll end there, take a very quick break, and I want you to just keep going right where you left off.
How do you raise the perfect kid? The answer is you don't, because perfection is a myth. In the book, How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay With It, by parenting author and columnist Lisa Sugarman and clinical psychotherapist Deborah Gansenberg, you'll get permission to drop some balls without feeling like a bad parent. Through Sugarman's humor and personal stories and proven tips and advice from Gansenberg's office couch, you'll have an everyday reminder that you're not alone, that all kids test limits, and that your kids will ultimately be okay. Find How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay With It on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble stores, and everywhere books are sold.
Hey friends, welcome back to Life Unfiltered. I'm Lisa Sugarman here with Deb Gansenberg for another Sunday conversation. And today we're talking about something that we really feel like parents are going to have to do a lot of dealing with this summer in particular, now that kids are out of school and they're a lot freer with their time. and going out and about more than they have been for a long time. It's consequences versus punishments, because I have a funny feeling that we're at that point of the year when things are a little loosey-goosey, and kids might be getting into stuff and making decisions, and maybe not always the greatest ones. And we're going to have to, be giving some consequences. And one thing we don't want to be doing, as we talked about before the break, is giving punishments, because, and Deb is going to talk a little bit more about why it's just not beneficial to be doling out punishments to your kids, when what we really want to do is be giving them consequences for their actions and the choices they make. So Deb, before the break, we talked about tips that you could give us as parents for making the consequences that we give to our kids more impactful. You gave one already, and I know you have more, so go.
Right. So one is, like you had shared, toe the line, definitely when it comes to setting anything up, consistency and follow through. You're making charts and things that are all important parts to creating a system. You need to make sure that you, as the parent, it works within your own skill set, which is really important. And the next part is keep your rules or your consequences simple, so there's no confusion.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I think we set our own selves up if we get too complex or too detailed. So spell it out so you and your kids can refer back to the list of consequences or rewards. I'm a huge fan of token economy. I know I've spoken about this many times on the show before, but it's a way to set up a system that when your kids earn a consequence or a reward, you can simply, like if they earn a consequence, you simply can remove a bean, the bean being the token, from the jar, instead of having to think quickly on your feet about you did that, so you lose television for a half hour and then you forget about it. So it's much easier to just remove a bean or a ticket or a pom-pom from a jar. If your child earns a reward, it's just as easy. Go put a bean in the jar. So it makes it easy for them and for you.
Yeah, like that.
And then you set it up that when they have earned beans, they can cash them in. So, if your son wants QT time with mom and wants to go for an ice cream, he can go to his jar and say, well, honey, how many beans you have in there? Because it's going to cost you 10 beans. It's great. You follow these rules and boundaries. You have beans in your jar. You want to go do this, cash them in. So this system also helps kids feel like they're in more control than they realize. Right. It's really nice and also it's an opportunity to learn what your child prefers. Do they get motivated by losing something or by gaining something, or a little?
That's a good point. That's a really good point, because that incentive, that just incentivizing things, can be a really, really powerful parenting tool.
That's right.
You're putting that choice over to them.
That's right. And one of my kids loved watching his ticket jar fill up. He was a saver. He's still a saver. It's so funny. And you learn about that part of them too. Like, oh, he's more of a saver. Oh, this one can't keep a ticket in his jar to save his life because he just wants to spend them. And he's more like that as a young adult. So I think kids can follow rules or break rules, listen or not listen, and they learn quickly that they can either earn rewards or consequences as well. So it makes it easier for us as parents to remind our kids they have a choice. They can listen, they can learn and follow the boundary of the limit and earn a bean, or don't listen and follow the rules and lose a bean. So encourage them to make a good choice and just really be clear and concise when you do it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's actually a great system, especially for any young parents who are listening right now. If you have younger kids, I think that's, a really easy tool to implement really quickly.
It is. Even with the older kids, I don't tell my kids this, although they're probably listening, but
I was about to say, yeah.
I kind of use the reward consequence thing still. Like, oh, you want the keys to the car? Could you empty the garbage first and then you can come? It trails right through, and they know I mean it because I always have. Yeah.
I mean, look, kids test limits, kids break rules. It's what they do. It's what they're wired for. You and I did the exact same thing when we were kids. So we're not sitting here saying we were any different than any other kids.
I was the curfew breaker.
Were you? Yeah. You know what? I never had a curfew. Did you know that? Did I ever tell you that? I never had a curfew. I always would just call my mom and tell her where I was and when I was coming home. And I just had this weird little instinct about when I needed to be home.
I was not lucky about that. And now, of course, I've been challenged in the same way on the receiving end, which is, I know, something my parents wished upon me as a parent someday. So I did it to them.
Payback's a bitch. But I mean, look, ultimately, it is our job as their parents to, and I'm using this word very specifically, to tame them. It's a job that takes endless amounts of time. So much dedication, tons of patience. You said that earlier, but it can be done because one way or another, it's almost like a rite of passage that our kids are doing these things. They have to do these
developmental.
Things. Right. There's a process here. And, a big part of growing up involves figuring out, the things that you can and can't get away with. We only need to look as far back as our own childhood for proof that we all do it to one degree or another. I mean, like how many times did you or your brothers push your parents' buttons? And I was an only child, so it was all me pushing all the buttons all the time.
We pushed different buttons.
Yeah.
I'm one brother definitely pushed certain buttons, and then my other brother would push and I would push different buttons. Just like my kids. I don't know about yours, but
yeah. And it's also too the whole like, well, mom said no, I'm gonna try for dad. And and they do that all the time. The
funny part is I didn't know I had these many buttons. And that's the fun thing that our kids teach us.
We
actually have to get pushed.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. And now it's like an art form for them.
Gosh, yeah.
Too often I think too often we just have to understand that it doesn't happen overnight. Too often we're bogged down with the idea that, we've taught someone something once, we should be kind of on to the next thing and they should get it, and they don't. And so that's where the whole patience piece comes in. And we have to teach, and we have to sustain new behavior, and that takes time. And we don't always want to invest that kind of time because it's a lot of it.
Gosh, no.
So, maybe talk for a minute and explain what you mean. In the book, in our book, you talk a lot about how identifying a start or a stop behavior takes awareness. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a great question. I think often when we are parenting, we ask our kids to do something, and sometimes it may not be clear to them what you're asking exactly. So they don't end up attempting or following through with your request, which is not great. We could be yelling, we could be confused ourselves. So when you think about parenting, quite often we are trying to encourage our kids to either stop doing something, like picking their nose or punching their brother or throwing food on the floor. And we are also constantly trying to get kids to start something, like start eating your breakfast, we're leaving for school soon, or start brushing your teeth, it's time to get ready for bed. So it's easy for parents if we can separate these behaviors into two categories. So behaviors you want your kids to stop and behaviors you want your kids to start. And with that being said, it makes it clearer and easier for you when giving directives and directions, and it gives your kids a greater chance of success. So as parents, it is important for us to be very mindful about how challenging and time-consuming it can be when we want to change a behavior. So, when your kid's doing something, you're saying, stop this or start that or don't do that. It takes time. So for instance, let's just say, like Lisa, okay, I'm going to start going back into November project. So I need to really start setting my alarm earlier each day to get up and go. The first day, it might be brutal for some, maybe not for you, but for some of us, it might be brutal. And to a point where when the alarm goes off, we might just want to turn over and roll over and go back to bed.
For people who don't know what that is, November Project is something, it's a fitness movement.
Yes.
Part of. So I get up very, very stupid early in the mornings, and I travel into Boston to work out. So that's what she's talking about.
So, so the second day, it's still tough and maybe still might involve contemplating rolling over, but you get up. And by the third day, it gets easier. You get my point. So over time, we know it's hard. Over time, you grow to learn a new behavior, you adapt, and then you maintain the change. So when thinking about trying to change your little one's behaviors, just remember it will take time. Think of yourself when you're trying to change a behavior. So when you request that your 7-year-old make his bed before school each day, and he really doesn't, he has never really done it before, model it and teach it with him, teach him and do it with him, provide the help and the guidance, and then eventually step back, watch him do it himself. And it might not be perfect or to your standard, but give him or her the time to learn how to do it and sustain that behavior and then master it. So after a few gentle reminders, if he or she doesn't attempt the request and ignores it, well, then they've earned themselves a consequence, right? Pull a bean out of the jar. So each child is different, though. So just remember, with various strengths and weaknesses, we need to remember that different requests can be challenging depending on your child.
Yeah, it's true. And so I'm pulling some research that we had done out of the book.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, according to responsiveclassroom.org, we need to give our kids logical consequences that are directly related to our kids' behaviors in order to help them fix their mistakes. For instance, when you're giving out consequences, you want to ensure that they're logical and that they correlate to whatever the misbehavior is in a way that kind of safeguards the integrity of the child. So keep in mind that it's our kids' behavior that's the issue, not the child. Also,
yes, that's a very good point.
And that's why I pulled this one out of the book. Pay attention to our tone of voice as a way of differentiating logical consequences from a full-on punishment. And remember that it's never what we say, but how we say it, which I also think is a really relevant point. Like if you start screaming at your kid to clean up the milk they just spilled by accident, you're not giving them a logical consequence. Now you're just punishing them. Make sure whatever consequence you're giving them it fits the offense. I mean, having your kid mop the floor because they spilled the milk is reasonable. Having your child mop the floor because they pulled their sister's hair is dumb and not relevant and doesn't make any sense.
Unless your floor is really dirty. I don't know.
Right. So most of the heavy lifting that we do as parents is really just about common sense. And our book is just about common sense. And both of those things go hand in hand when raising kids. Unfortunately, not all of us are born with equal parts common sense and spine, which goes back to the whole holding the line part.
Yeah.
So whether you're thinking about it this way or not, the truth is we're all products of who and where we come from, at least to some degree. And that means that who our kids become as people, for the most part, is a pretty direct result of how we handle them as kids. So, I know that, and how we hold them accountable for the things that they do when they're growing up. So I think that's probably, I know we're out of time. I think that might be the most logical place to end. But I'm glad that we had this conversation so that people can really just kind of understand, like there's a way to approach it and not approach it.
And there are a lot of great resources to help learn that. So if you're looking for a few, feel free to reach out and contact me through email or Lisa at foxganzenberg@yahoo.com or Lisa Sugarman at hotmail.com.
Yeah. And you can reach us with any topic you want us to talk about on the show. Just connect with us on Facebook or Instagram by searching Life Unfiltered on North Shore 104.9 FM.
Right. And if you missed us or any show, you can find us on iTunes by searching Life Unfiltered. And don't forget to subscribe. For all of those parents, either with young kids or teens or young adult kids that are pushing their buttons and testing their limits, just remember to be gentle to yourself.
Just remember, we're all a work in progress, and it's all about the climb. Be kind to each other. We'll be back to chat again next week.
Thank you for listening to Life Unfiltered with your hosts, Deborah Gansenberg and Lisa Sugarman, authors of How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay With It. Find the book on Amazon.com or at bookstores everywhere.